Push harder on the left. We must follow the river eastward.
What if I told you that the greatest rebellion of the 16th century took place not in palaces, but in the midst of damp, impenetrable forests? Are you ready to learn the truth about the man who defied the most powerful empire of his time while living thousands of kilometers from civilization? This daring warrior took a step that, in those days, was considered unthinkable sacrilege and a sure path to the executioner's block.
In the shadow of giant tropical trees, he proclaimed himself ruler of a new land, without waiting for approval from distant Europe.
His figure remains shrouded in dark legends and debates over whether he was a genius or a complete madman. The Spanish crown considered him a dangerous fanatic who had crossed every conceivable boundary of loyalty and state law. To official Madrid, he became the living embodiment of treason, which had to be eradicated at any cost. The monarchs could not believe that one of their subjects would dare to openly declare his secession from the most powerful house in Europe. At that time, loyalty to the king was the foundation of the universe, and its violation threatened chaos for the entire colonial system. Entire detachments were sent out to capture the rebel, but the jungle reliably protected its new master. Their expedition turned into an endless search for legendary treasures, which with each passing day, distanced them further from their familiar world. The deeper they penetrated into the heart of the continent, the less significance the decrees signed across the ocean held.
In this humid hell, a new morality was born, where survival was more important than the laws of the Inquisition or taxes in favor of the crown.
People changed before our eyes, transforming from servants of the empire into free-spirited adventurers whose fate hung by a thread. Their entire world was now limited to the perimeter of the camp and the sharp blade of a trusty sword. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how one conquistador managed to legally declare his independence from the king right on the deck of a wooden raft. What was found in the old archives completely changes our usual perception of expeditions in search of El Dorado. The Golden City was not just a dot on the map, but an obsession that drove people to sell their stone homes in Europe. Instead of a quiet life, they chose to build enormous wooden rafts on the swampy banks of South American rivers. They loaded these rickety structures with heavy wrought iron chests, supplies of salted meat, and unwieldy iron cannons. The very idea of searching for the mythical city supplanted common sense, turning the expedition's participants into fanatics driven by a single goal. Preparations for the expedition in 1560 resembled the large-scale relocation of an entire city. Hundreds of people gathered on the banks of the Amazon's tributaries, cutting down enormous trees and hammering together massive vessels.
They brought with them heavy metal cuirasses, completely unsuitable for the humid and hot equatorial climate.
Loading provisions took weeks as the Europeans tried to bring their familiar way of life into the wild, humid environment. Huge supplies of grain and hardtack quickly became moldy under the constant tropical humidity. European clothing made of thick wool and velvet quickly became soaked and turned into heavy rags. People were forced to adapt to the new conditions, changing their habits and ways of interacting in the confined space. Gradually, the visual distinctions between noble officers in silk and ordinary sailors in coarse cloth began to fade. The strict hierarchy established by royal decrees on paper began to crack at the seams under the pressure of daily hard labor. In these harsh conditions, practical navigation skills and the ability to make quick decisions came to the fore. The expedition moved forward slowly, turning into a floating settlement isolated from the rest of the world. Huge wooden rafts became the only solid island of safety amid the endless expanse of water and a solid wall of greenery. On these creaking structures, people slept, cooked food over open fires, mended torn sails, and engaged in endless arguments. The lack of clear prospects and constant fatigue created the perfect breeding ground for deep discontent.
Aguirre carefully gauged the mood of the crowd, gathering around him the most resilient and disillusioned members of the expedition.
In this closed ecosystem, new political alliances and secret initiative groups began to form. People gathered at night near the barrels of fresh water, quietly discussing plans to replace the official leadership. The humid air was literally saturated with general suspicion, and every careless word could lead to isolation. Aguirre became a magnet for all dissenters, offering them a clear and radical path out of the crisis. He skillfully channeled his supporters' discontent, forging a unified and disciplined unit out of disparate groups. The myth of the Golden Cities finally gave way to a real struggle for control over the wooden fleet. The expedition members realized that control over the ships and supplies was the only guarantee of their continued survival. It would be very interesting to hear your perspective on such extreme historical events. What do you think about how the wild can completely destroy centuries-old social foundations? Share your thoughts in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to our channel to continue delving into the mysteries of the past with us. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how water and moisture destroyed steel and the human will? The Amazon's green labyrinth was an impenetrable wall of intertwined vines and giant tree trunks. The river water was thick, murky, and carried a vast number of uprooted trees. For days on end, the Spaniards gazed at this monotonous landscape, seeing not a single patch of dry land suitable for landing. The wood of the rafts gradually swelled, grew heavy, and began to rot slowly under the constant dampness. The heat was unbearable, turning the river valley into a giant natural steam room without the slightest breath of fresh air. The air was so thick and humid that every breath required considerable physical effort. Clothing never dried completely, clinging to the body and causing a constant feeling of severe discomfort. The metal rivets on the leather straps became covered with a green patina, and the straps themselves swelled and lost their strength.
Spanish arquebuses required constant cleaning and lubrication. Otherwise, the gun mechanisms would seize up completely from rust.
Navigation under such conditions demanded incredible visual strain and constant concentration. The helmsman would peer into the murky water for hours, trying to make out hidden shoals and dangerous underwater currents. The use of familiar nautical charts and astronomical instruments proved to be a completely futile endeavor. Thick tree canopies obscured the stars, depriving navigators of the ability to determine the fleet's exact geographical position. The expedition moved blindly, relying entirely on the unpredictable and powerful river current. The lack of physical activity on the cramped decks led to muscle atrophy and general weakness. Soldiers, accustomed to long marches on foot, suffered from the inability to stretch their legs on solid ground. The wooden planks of the deck would become scorching hot during the day and turn icy cold as the night deepened. They had to sleep haphazardly, sheltering under scraps of old canvas from the frequent equatorial downpours. This constant physical exhaustion directly affected the morale of the once fearsome conquerors. The space of the raft became their only reality, replacing continents, cities, and familiar homes. Their entire lives were concentrated within a few square meters of roughly hewn, damp wood. The boundaries of this wooden world were strictly guarded, and falling overboard meant instant disappearance into the murky water. The Conquistadors constantly repaired their vessels, replacing rotten logs with new ones fished straight from the river. This endless process of repair became a kind of ritual, sustaining the illusion of control over the situation. In this monotonous struggle against the elements, moral norms and customary social taboos began to fade. Survival depended solely on physical strength, agility, and the ability to react quickly to threats. Weakness or indecision were harshly punished as they jeopardized the safety of the entire crew. Aguirre methodically used this harsh environment to forge a squad of fighters loyal to him personally. He proved through action that only iron discipline could keep the fleet intact.
The surrounding labyrinth of greenery and water became the perfect setting for the impending political coup.
Nature isolated the rebels from the law, giving them time to prepare their radical plans. Do you agree that extreme environments always give rise to harsh forms of governance and leadership? Please share your thoughts on this, as every opinion is very valuable. And in the next chapter, you'll learn how the rebels managed to make their rebellion legally sound. The hidden code that changes everything lies in the incredible bureaucracy of the Spanish rebels. Instead of a simple armed seizure of the ships, Aguirre decided to pursue a complex legal procedure. In the very heart of the wild jungle, the mutineers took out ink, quills, and thick paper brought from Europe. They began drafting official documents, meticulously recording the reasons for their dissatisfaction with the current command. This surreal contrast between the surrounding primeval nature and the strict paperwork of official record-keeping is truly striking. The documents were drafted by the dim light of oil lamps on rickety wooden tables right in the middle of the river. Every word was carefully crafted to give the coup the appearance of a legitimate, well-founded action.
It is interesting to observe how the Spanish mindset demanded that even the most radical violation of the law be legitimized.
The rebels could not simply destroy the old world. They had to immediately build a new one on paper. They copied the structure of the colonial administration, transplanting it onto the decks of their damp riverboats. Every order was recorded in special journals to preserve history for future generations. This obsessive drive for record-keeping demonstrated the deep-rooted nature of European bureaucratic traditions. The documents were carefully hidden in leather tubes, protecting them from the destructive effects of equatorial humidity. Special secretaries oversaw the preservation of the archive, understanding its immense political value. The loss of these papers would have meant the loss of the entire campaign's legitimacy in the eyes of the participants themselves. The written declarations served as a moral shield, protecting the rebels from doubt and fear of the future. They transformed a crowd of weary and desperate people into an organized political force with clear goals. These documents proclaimed complete independence from the rule of the Spanish crown. For the first time in the New World, Europeans officially refused to obey the orders of their monarch. They declared themselves free citizens with the right to choose their own ruler. This document was centuries ahead of its time, laying the foundations for the anti-colonial rhetoric of the future. The wooden rafts became the first independent territory beyond the control of the great transatlantic empire.
Bureaucracy became the rebels' main weapon, turning a trivial revolt into a true revolution.
These yellowed pages still preserve the memory of the incredible audacity of people lost in the forests. They chose paper independence over real security, signing their own death warrant. I hope this unconventional perspective has helped you better understand the complex nature of historical upheavals. If you enjoyed this in-depth analysis of the documentary side of the rebellion, be sure to like this video. What the government doesn't want you to know is contained in the personal letters of this Spanish rebel. These letters were radically different from the standard sycophantic reports of colonial officials. The Conquistador wrote to King Philip II not as a submissive vassal, but as an equal political opponent. The text was replete with direct accusations against the royal court, mired in luxury and bureaucracy. Aguirre openly reproached the monarch for having forgotten the veterans who toiled in the new lands. In his letters, the rebel described in detail the grueling conditions of service in the South American colonies. He listed the miles of swamps traversed, the wrecked ships, and the damaged expedition equipment. These dry facts came together to form a sweeping picture of total disregard for the needs of ordinary pioneers. The paper became a canvas on which Aguirre painted the gulf between real labor and court intrigues. He demanded recognition of his merits not as a favor, but as the absolutely legitimate right of a laborer. The rhetoric of the letters was devoid of the flowery language and diplomatic niceties customary for the time. It was the harsh language of a military camp, transposed onto royal parchment. The author of the letters did not ask for forgiveness for his rebellion, but logically justified its historical inevitability. He asserted that the crown itself had violated the social contract by depriving its subjects of just protection. Such philosophical depth in the argumentation made these texts unique political manifestos of the era. The texts often included detailed lists of confiscated property and redistributed provisions. Aguirre, with the meticulousness of an accountant, reported on exactly how he was managing the expedition's resources. He demonstrated his effectiveness as an administrator, capable of bringing order to the chaos of the wild. These economic calculations served as an additional argument in favor of the legitimacy of his self-proclaimed authority. He showed that the new state was capable of functioning independently without looking back to the distant capital. With each new page, the tone of the messages grew increasingly harsh and uncompromising. The rebel began threatening to block river trade routes and inflict economic damage on Spanish interests. He realized his strategic invulnerability, situated in the heart of impenetrable equatorial forests. The forest and the river became his natural fortress, out of reach of the regular royal troops. This geographical advantage was reflected in every haughty line of his historic letters. Every letter he sent became an irreversible step, forever cutting off the path to pardon. Aguirre deliberately burned his bridges, asserting his absolute right to rebel against injustice. These documents have been preserved in the archives, becoming an invaluable source for studying the psychology of political rebellion. They show just how far a person can go when they realize they have complete impunity far from civilization. Have you ever written letters that could forever change your fate and status? In the next chapter, we will learn how absolute power destroys the human psyche from within. Having gained complete control over the expedition, Aguirre faced the main curse of absolute power. The constant fear of losing his authority began to rapidly distort his perception of reality. It seemed to him that every sailor's glance or officer's whisper harbored the threat of a new secret conspiracy. This growing suspicion forced him to take increasingly harsh and radical preventive measures. The atmosphere on the rafts shifted from one of enthusiasm to one that was deeply oppressive and paralyzing to the human will. The leader of the uprising began methodically eliminating any potential political rivals within his team. Former allies who had helped him seize power suddenly found themselves in disfavor and were completely isolated. Aguirre restructured the command system, concentrating all key processes exclusively in his own hands. He demanded reports on every action, controlling the distribution of even the smallest portions of food and gunpowder. A system of mutual surveillance entangled the fleet in an invisible web of mistrust and constant fear. The influence of paranoia even affected the expedition's route, which constantly changed for no apparent logical reason. Aguirre ordered them to avoid any stops along the shore, fearing ambushes by hypothetical enemies. The ships moved in zigzags, trying to stay in the channel and avoid the dense thickets along the riverbanks. This greatly slowed their progress and increased the consumption of their already meager fresh water supplies. The rational arguments of experienced navigators were rejected if they contradicted the leader's inner fears. To maintain his power, he made the most difficult decisions, even regarding his own family. Seeking to completely shield his loved ones from the influence of political rivals, he isolated them in a separate compartment. Aguirre believed that any family ties could be exploited by enemies for blackmail and manipulation. This emotional coldness frightened his subordinates more than the strictest disciplinary measures. He clearly demonstrated that he was willing to sacrifice absolutely everything for the sake of preserving the new state. Documentation, which had previously served as a symbol of legitimacy, became a tool of total control. Special scribes recorded every spoken phrase, creating thick dossiers on the expedition members. Any careless word could become grounds for immediate removal from office. People learned to communicate in short, meaningless phrases, avoiding any political assessment of the situation. Silence became the primary means of self-preservation on these rotten wooden vessels. Power for power's sake had become the sole purpose of existence for this exhausted river community. Each new day brought further personnel reshuffles and a tightening of internal regulations. People stopped trusting one another, turning into silent executors of their leader's will. The psychological pressure reached a critical point, completely stifling the initiative of the rank-and-file members. The flotilla was now governed not by common sense, but by one man's deep personal paranoia. I will reveal the best-kept secret of how a state was built without a single scrap of solid ground. Aguirre's flotilla was a unique urban development project realized on the surface of the river. Several dozen rafts and converted brigantines were tied together with thick hemp ropes. This allowed the entire mass to move at the same speed, forming a single, unbroken transport network. Movement between the vessels took place along narrow, rickety planks stretched over the churning, muddy water. Each raft had its own specific functional purpose within this floating, self-sufficient settlement. Special vessels were designated for storing barrels of gunpowder, food supplies, and blacksmithing equipment. The command post was located on a separate flagship, surrounded by rafts of loyal guards. This zoning of the space allowed for maintaining order and preventing chaos during emergency maneuvers. The Ghost Kingdom possessed all the necessary infrastructure to meet its basic needs. Steering this cumbersome structure required the coordinated work of dozens of experienced helmsmen. To turn the entire fleet in unison, sound signals were used, transmitted via copper trumpets. Any delay on a single raft could lead to the ropes snapping and the collapse of neighboring wooden vessels. Coordination was achieved through daily, grueling training of the crew. The men learned to understand orders from a single hand gesture by the flagship navigator. Life in this aquatic state was governed by a strict schedule that never varied by even a minute. Time was measured by the turning of hourglasses, which were closely monitored by a special officer on duty. Meal times, guard changes, and equipment maintenance were scheduled down to the second. This routine helped combat the stress of constant isolation and gave meaning to the monotonous days. A person became a cog in a vast machine whose sole purpose was perpetual motion. Even entertainment in this confined space took on a specific, austere character. Soldiers passed the time repairing armor, braiding new ropes, and quietly reminiscing about the past. Gambling was strictly forbidden to avoid conflicts and knife fights over debts. In rare moments of calm, the sailors sang old Castilian songs, the sound of which was lost in the roar of the river. These sounds of home seemed utterly alien against the backdrop of the solid green wall of the Amazon jungle. This ghostly, watery world continued its relentless journey toward a terrifying unknown. Their isolation from land made the men hostages not only to nature, but also to a harsh political system. Their reality had shrunk to the dimensions of a wooden deck, upon which grand historical dramas unfolded. Their entire lives depended on the strength of the ropes and the integrity of the tarred logs. How long could you keep your sanity in such a confined, wave-rocked space? In the next chapter, We will examine in detail exactly how these cumbersome structures were steered through the current. The scale of the Amazon struck the imagination of Europeans who were accustomed to the narrow, calm rivers of the continent. In some places, the riverbed was so wide that the opposite bank was hidden beyond the horizon. The water carried a huge amount of silt, making the river resemble slowly flowing yellow clay. The force of the current was colossal, and the flotilla moved forward almost without the aid of sails or oars. The navigator's main task was not so much to gain speed as to keep the vessels on a safe course. The greatest threat to the wooden rafts was the trunks of sunken giant trees. They lay hidden beneath the murky surface of the water, capable of piercing the brigantine's hull in an instant. Lookouts with long poles stood watch at the bow of each vessel around the clock, probing the path ahead. Upon detecting danger, they sounded a loud signal, and the helmsman struck the heavy oars with all their might. This process required tremendous physical endurance and instant reactions from the entire crew. Numerous tributaries created a complex system of currents that knocked the rafts off course. At the confluence of rivers, powerful whirlpools formed, capable of dragging a small boat to the bottom. When passing through such sections, the vessels were tied together to increase the fleet's overall mass and stability. The captain of each raft had to strictly follow the flagship's maneuvers, ensuring the ropes remained taut. A single misstep could lead to a collision and the destruction of the entire wooden structure. Depth measurements were taken every half hour using a rope with a lead weight at the end. The bottom relief was extremely uneven. Deep depressions gave way abruptly to sandy shoals. Running aground with a huge, heavily loaded raft meant days of hard labor to free it. The conquistadors had to jump into the murky water and physically push the vessel into deeper water. Under these conditions, the cargo often had to be moved from one side of the deck to the other to maintain balance. Mooring near the shore for the night was a distinct art of engineering in the jungle. Dropping anchor in the current was unsafe, as the bottom consisted of soft silt that could not hold metal. The vessels had to be brought close to the shore and tied with thick ropes to sturdy tree trunks. But the shore often turned out to be a boggy swamp that could not withstand the tension of the ropes. It was far from always possible to find a reliable and safe mooring spot every evening. The rainy season further complicated the already difficult navigational conditions on the Amazon. The water level rose by several meters, flooding vast coastal areas and changing the river's course. The river burst its banks, turning into an endless freshwater sea with trees hidden beneath the water. The current speed increased many times over, depriving the crews of the ability to control the movement of the rafts. The flotilla turned into a splinter, mercilessly carried by the elements toward the ocean. The months spent on this grueling voyage turned the conquistadors into highly skilled river navigators. They learned to understand the language of the great river, predict changes in the weather, and navigate around invisible obstacles. This unique experience came at the cost of incredible physical exhaustion and constant mental strain. Yet it was precisely these skills that allowed Agirre's Phantom Kingdom to traverse thousands of miles through hostile territory. Their journey down the Amazon became an extraordinary, if grim, example of the triumph of will over the elements. The absence of an open sky became one of the most severe psychological trials for the expedition members. In the narrow sections of the river, enormous trees leaned over the water, forming a dense green canopy. Sunlight filtered through the foliage in sparse, thin rays, providing neither warmth nor adequate illumination. The flotilla seemed to be moving through an endless tunnel, the walls of which were woven from living, damp plants. This created a persistent sense of confinement, despite the vastness of the continent itself. The air temperature beneath this green dome remained consistently high both day and night. The vegetation trapped heat and moisture, creating the effect of a gigantic, stifling greenhouse. Sweat did not evaporate from the skin, but dripped in large drops, soaking through clothing and irritating the skin. It was hard to breathe due to the high concentration of vapors and the smell of rotting organic matter. The air was so thick that it seemed like an almost tangible physical barrier. The soundscape of the jungle exerted immense pressure on the Europeans' exhausted nervous systems. The river echoed every sound repeatedly, creating a reverberating echo that never ceased for a second. The crack of falling old trees carried for miles, startling the sailors with its suddenness. The incessant noise of water lapping against the wooden sides of the rafts became an unbearable backdrop to life. In this acoustic environment, it was impossible to find silence even in the deepest hours of the night. Constant dampness seeped everywhere, destroying materials that had seemed eternal to the Europeans. The pages of valuable legal documents and letters to the king stuck together and became covered with black spots. Wooden powder chests had to be wrapped in several layers of oiled canvas. Clothing took on a musty odor that could not be removed even after prolonged washing. Life in such an environment required enormous effort to maintain even a modicum of comfort. Heavy gray clouds often hung low over the river, pouring down in prolonged tropical rains. Water poured from the sky in a solid wall, instantly filling the open holds of rafts and boats. The crews had to spend hours bailing water with wooden buckets to prevent the vessels from sinking. The rain was warm but brought no relief, only increasing the overall humidity. On such days, the boundary between the sky and the river was completely erased in a solid gray haze. Aguirre skillfully exploited this oppressive atmosphere to maintain his harsh political regime. When nature itself acts as an overseer, people require less external control. The soldiers' attention was consumed by the struggle against the heat and humidity, leaving them no energy to organize resistance. The forest became the dictator's natural ally, crushing the will of his subordinates with its vast scale. Under such conditions, even the boldest rebel would sooner or later surrender to the majesty of the elements. The sense of time on the river was completely distorted, as the days were indistinguishable from one another. The absence of changing seasons in the equatorial climate deprived people of their usual temporal landmarks. A week could feel like a year, while a month flew by like a single, endlessly long and stifling day. Keeping track of the calendar was an enormous struggle, and disputes often arose over the exact current date. Life had turned into one continuous process of moving through a green, stifling infinity. Food prepared under such conditions took on a distinct taste of smoke and damp wood. Fires were lit directly on the damp decks, on a layer of sand, or in iron braziers. The firewood burned poorly, giving off a lot of acrid smoke that stung the eyes and made breathing difficult. The ration consisted of dry flatbreads and scraps of salted meat that had long since lost its nutritional value. Food became merely fuel for sustaining physical strength, having lost any taste value. This endless green tunnel became a veritable purgatory for the expedition of Spanish conquistadors. Nature broke their pride, forcing them to adapt to the harshest conditions of existence on the planet. The jungle paid no heed to the loud political declarations and legal statuses of the travelers. It merely continued to test their endurance with heat, humidity, and its monumental monotony. Only the most resilient managed to keep their sanity until the moment the river began to change its character. After long months of exhausting sailing, the river's character began to change gradually and noticeably. The riverbed widened so much that the banks turned into barely discernible dark streaks on the horizon. The green canopy of the jungle receded, revealing a vast, clear sky and bright sun to the exhausted Spaniards. The current slowed, and the water, once murky yellow, began to take on a darker, deeper hue. These visual changes were the first sign that the endless labyrinth was coming to an end. The appearance of tides became undeniable proof of the Atlantic Ocean's proximity. Twice a day, the water level rose and the river's current reversed, pushing the rafts backward. For the navigators, this meant they had to radically change their tactics for steering the heavy vessels. Now, they had to drop heavy anchors during high tide and move only during low tide. This rhythm, dictated by the moon, replaced the monotony of the constant river current. The transition from fresh water to salt water caused serious problems with the supply of drinking water. Fresh water supplies had to be replenished before heading out into the open ocean, which required landing on shore. Crews carrying barrels ventured deep into the coastal thickets, risking getting lost in the mangrove swamps. The water at the river's mouth was brackish, unsuitable for long-term storage in wooden containers. This logistical crisis further exacerbated tensions within the exhausted riverine state. The vastness of the Amazon estuary created the illusion that the expedition was already in the open sea. Huge waves whipped up by the wind crashed against the flat sides of the rafts, flooding the decks with salt water. The rocking became constant, requiring the crews to develop new skills in balancing and securing cargo. People unaccustomed to life at sea suffered from seasickness and severe physical weakness. The transition to a new environment required yet another painful adjustment for the entire seafaring community. As they approached the ocean, Aguirre's political ambitions flared up with a new, frightening intensity. He viewed the voyage out to sea not as a salvation, but as a springboard for a new phase of his campaign. His plans included seizing coastal Spanish settlements and using their resources for the army. The flotilla began preparing its rusted weapons, cleaning the arquebuses, and counting the supplies of dry gunpowder. The Paper Kingdom was preparing to enter into a real armed conflict with the colonial authorities. Preparations for setting sail were accompanied by a final tightening of discipline aboard the flagship. Aguirre personally inspected the readiness of each raft, tolerating no objections or delays. Fear of the unknown ocean forced the men to obey his sharp commands without question. They understood that on the open sea, their lives depended entirely on the strength of the lashed-together logs. The dictator used this fear to finally crush any remaining traces of free thought. The end of the river journey marked the beginning of a new, even more dangerous chapter in the history of this rebellion. The illusion of isolation had been shattered, and now the Conquistadors were about to face the real world of the Empire. The voyage out to sea marked the end of their grand and grim journey through the Green Labyrinth. The phantom state on the water was preparing to make its presence known with a resounding voice, using paper decrees and old swords. Ahead of them lay an inevitable confrontation, the consequences of which would forever alter the historical chronicles of the New World. Centuries later, historians continue to debate who Lope de Aguirre truly was. To some, he remains a symbol of utter madness, a man whose ambitions destroyed the expedition from within. To others, he appears as the first harbinger of independence, a man who threw down a legal challenge to the colonial system. His paper state, created on wooden rafts, became a unique political phenomenon of the era. This paradox of a bureaucratic rebellion in the wild makes his figure incredibly compelling. Archives have preserved dozens of documents written by the light of smoky lamps in the middle of the Amazon. These texts are studied by legal scholars as an example of a perverse yet logical legal system. They reflect a human attempt to impose order on chaos through paragraphs, seals, and strict lists. Aguirre's papers demonstrate that the idea of a state can exist even without a fixed territory. They prove the power of bureaucracy, capable of holding together a disparate crowd of desperate armed men. Despite all the regime's crimes, one cannot deny the colossal willpower of the participants in this unprecedented voyage. They traversed thousands of miles through hostile territory, battling heat, dampness, and disease. Their endurance and ability to adapt to inhuman conditions command the involuntary respect of researchers. These people demonstrated the limits of human physical capabilities, working themselves to exhaustion without the slightest hope of rescue. The Amazon became the site of their greatest life trial, which only a few survived. The rhetoric of independence embedded in Aguirre's letters found its echo in later anti-colonial uprisings. His arguments about the injustice of royal rule were echoed by many leaders of South American revolutions. He was the first to articulate the idea that the conquerors of new lands have the right to self-governance. These ideas, set down on rough paper, outlived their author and became part of the continent's political thought. The rebel was ahead of his time, speaking the language of freedom long before official declarations of independence. The Spanish crown made every effort to erase the memory of this shameful and dangerous rebellion. Official chroniclers portrayed Aguirre exclusively in a negative light, denying him the right to hold a political position. However, destroying the legend of the floating state proved more difficult than suppressing the armed rebellion itself. Stories of chests containing documents lost in the jungle were passed down by word of mouth among sailors and soldiers. The rebellion turned into a grim myth, frightening some and inspiring others to new adventures. Today, the story of this expedition serves as excellent material for in-depth research by sociologists and psychologists. It shows that civilization is a thin veneer that is easily eroded under extreme environmental conditions. When external laws disappear, people create their own, relying on their primal instincts and fears. The floating kingdom became a mirror reflecting all the contradictions of the age of great geographical discoveries. It blended a thirst for profit, incredible bravery, and cold bureaucratic calculation. The myth of the man who declared war on the king from the depths of the jungle lives on in literature and cinema. His image has transformed, becoming a symbol of the struggle against circumstances and one's own dark nature. These events remind us that the most terrifying demons lurk not in the forests, but within man himself. The story of Aguirre is a chronicle of the triumph of will and absolute political madness against the backdrop of the majestic Amazon. The story of Lope de Aguirre demonstrates how extreme conditions can alter the course of human thought and political history. This expedition became not merely a geographical exploration, but a profound psychological experiment in the creation of a new society. We saw how ambition, multiplied by isolation, led to an unprecedented challenge to the greatest transatlantic empires. Let us know in the comments what other historical mysteries and unusual expeditions you'd like to explore in our next videos. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new, fascinating investigations into the incredible mysteries of the past.